panel, Liberal Economy and Illiberal Polity, brings together perspectives from economics, public policy, political commentary, and reflective practice to examine contemporary India through scholarship, experience, and public debate. We are honored to have as panelists, Karthik Muralidharan, who's Tata Chancellor's Professor of Economics at the University of California, San Diego. His research spans public finance and development economics, and his publications include Accelerating India's Development, a state-led roadmap for effective governance. He is the co-founder and scientific director of the Center of Effective Governance of Indian States and has been actively engaged in policy advising and public communication of research. Also with us is Sanjaya, author of several influential books, including Secession of the Successful, India's Power Elite, How P.V. Narasimha Rao Made History, and The Accidental Prime Minister. He has served as editor of leading Indian newspapers and was media advisor to the former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and has taught at universities in India and abroad. This conversation will be moderated by Suchitra Shenoy, writer and teacher in the Buddhist tradition. She is the author of Mindful Parenting and co-author of Infinite Vision and teaches practices rooted in the discourses of the Buddha. She holds degrees from Brandeis University and the London School of Economics. Over to you, Suchitra.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. Can I encourage people who are sitting all the way out there, if you find spots here, just move up. It makes it easier for us to see people when it's question time. So we have two fantastic books this afternoon and a lot to discuss. Since there are themes that run between Sanjaya's book and Karthik's book, but they also really stand out on their own, I thought the way we could do this session is to have two questions for each person, and then we'll have a common question, and then we'll open it out to the public. So Sanjaya, let's start with you. Secession of the Successful. So wealth usually protects in India, right? It gives you access to power, and it protects from the kind of daily drudgery and challenges of living. And yet in your book, you really map very effectively and disconcertingly the recent flight out of India of the wealthy. So could you please say a bit more?
Thank you. Thank you, Suchitra, and thank you to Hyderabad Literary Festival for inviting me here. You know, usually when I've been talking about my book in different parts of the country, the first question I'd like to ask, if you don't mind, from the audience is, will all those who have at least one relative living outside India raise your hand? Thank you very much. And that about proves the basic hypothesis of my book, which is about elite migration or elite emigration out of India. I document 3 waves of large-scale migration. But if you look at the earlier 2 waves, in the 19th century of indentured labor, they were the poorest of the poor in the most backward parts of the country. Bengal, Orissa, Northeast, Andhra coast, who went as indentured labor to different parts of the world, virtually enslaved. The second large wave was the Gulf working class from Kerala, from Telangana, from Maharashtra, going as workers to the Gulf in the 1970s and 80s. What we are now seeing are wealthy, prosperous, middle class, upper middle class, 27,000 millionaires in the last 10 years giving up Indian citizenship. 32 lakh Indians have left the country. So the focus of my book is to ask the question, why? It is entirely understandable that poor people migrate, have always migrated. That's not a new phenomenon. You migrate in search of opportunity, you migrate away from hardship and towards opportunity. But as you correctly said, if you are in India and a millionaire, why would you want to migrate? And that's the question I address in my book, that here is a country in which those of us who are better off, who have access to good education and have acquired good talent, are leaving. And then, of course, the important point I make in the book is that the last time any economist of any significance addressed this question was in the early 1980s, when Jagdish Bhagwati wrote a book, when the phenomenon was just beginning. And over the last 25 years, when the numbers are simply accelerating, nobody has looked at this. So that's my book.
Now to go a little bit deeper, can you talk a little bit, which is a fairly significant part of the book, about this whole Yankee Hindutva or Rashtradut phenomena, which is the political and economic involvement of NRIs in India's politics, right? And how the diaspora can actually be a double-edged sword. And since we're at the Hyderabad Literature Festival, and you have roots here, maybe a little bit not just about the Indian diaspora, but also the kind of skilled Telugu migrant.
Actually, Telugu migrant, let me begin from the last. Telugu migrants are interesting because the first time the door opened for talented Indians was in 1966, when the United States liberalized its visa policy to allow doctors and engineers from India to emigrate to the United States. Till then, US policy only allowed for emigration from Europe, mostly from Europe. But in the mid-60s, the US was running short of doctors and engineers. And guess who took that opportunity, grabbed it by both hands? The Andhras from Andhra Medical College, Andhra Engineering College, Andhra University, some from Usmania Medical College, Gandhi Medical College. So it is really Visakhapatnam, Vijayawada, Guntur and Hyderabad that grabbed that opportunity in the mid-60s. And over the years, the Telugu is now the second most spoken Indian language in the United States. We have a temple for visa gods outside Hyderabad, right? So we Telugus have kind of become notorious in this scheme of things. But your question about Indians and their Hindutva. So this is one of the issues, one of the questions I ask. Because in the last 10 years particularly, we have seen when the Prime Minister travels abroad, people are all very enthusiastically saying Bharat Mata ki Jai, Jai Hind. I mean, you have at Houston, Wembley Stadium, London, Singapore, everywhere. It's become a television phenomenon, right? Indians all over the world. And the question I ask is, everybody, including the Prime Minister of the country, is celebrating this. Oh, the Indians are all over the world. Why is nobody asking the question, why are so many Indians all over the world? And that's the question I ask in my book. That it's one thing to celebrate the fact, oh, my school, I am from Hyderabad Public School, and my school alumni association is very proud. So many of our students are CEOs of American companies, from Satya Nadella down, right? And I asked my school, why the hell are you celebrating the success of your students who have left this country? And this is across the country. And I look at this phenomenon of, learning, going from migrating to seek education to seeking education to migrate. I have a whole chapter on that. The growth of the education export industry. All these guys go abroad and then say Bharat Mata ki Jai. And what kind of patriotism is this? Why don't you come back to Bharat Mata? And I've never got an answer to this question. It's different audiences around the country. I've said, Okay, if you're so feeling so patriotic, why the hell are you in New Jersey and not in Muzaffarabad, right? And of course, we know the answer. But I think there's a dichotomy in the way in which we perceive the diaspora as a great achievement, that Indians are all over the world. Indians are doing so well in the United States. 22,000 academics head institutions in the United States. Indian academics, 22,000, right? Why are they not heading in academic institutions in India? So I think there is a serious issue of looking at the phenomenon not as a great achievement, but in fact as a commentary on the absence of opportunity in India. A commentary on this hypocrisy of feeling patriotic once you have left the country.
Thank you. That's really insightful, I think, over there. Karthik, let's move to you. In accelerating India's development, Karthik has pretty much poured his life's work so far. It's a great muscle-building book, quite literally. And he really shows kind of Indian states a roadmap, right, for policy and governance. And so let's take two big areas that are close to most people's hearts here, which is health and education, where states have a fair amount of control and leeway. So states and the central government spend lakhs of crores. I think you have 13 lakh crores in the book. And yet 50 to 70% of Indians choose private services, even if they can't afford to. So why is it so dysfunctional? And can you give us some maybe practical choice-based systems at the state level that you suggest?
Thanks, Suchitra. Thanks, HLF. And it's a pleasure to be here with Sanjay. It's interesting. I think in some ways, there's an earlier book by Shankar Iyer called The Gated Republic that talks a lot about the secession of Indian elites from service recipients in India. And Sanjay is kind of the global version of that same thing. And, I think, so the story of my book is, I'm a public finance economist, but have been, deeply motivated for 25 years of my journey of essentially improving public services, mainly because it is the most important vehicle for kind of getting, the promise of democracy is one person, one vote, right? So, but markets are wonderful things in the sense that they reward innovation, incentives, and all of the good stuff, except that the market values you on a 1 rupee, 1 vote principle, right? So if you look at what is the main instrument we have to take the idealism of democratic equality to anything that looks like equality of opportunity, it really has to go through public services, right? I mean, through education, through health, that allow the marginalized to kind of have at least something close to a level playing field, right? And so that's always been my area of passion. But I think the reason for writing this book is over a 20-year journey, what I kind of realized is that most of our discussions happen at a sectoral level, saying, here's what we need for education, here's what we need for health, here's what we need for child development. But in fact, the cross-cutting issues of governance are really the common pain point across everything, right? So every sectoral discussion talks about we need to increase the budget, okay? So education wallahs want 6% of GDP, health wallahs want 3%, defense wants more money, police wants more money, everybody wants more money, right? The problem with that strategy is there's two problems. One, we don't have the money, okay? So we already run the largest deficits in the world, okay? So every year there is this delicate game played between the line department and finance department, where the department will ask for more money than they will get. They know finance will say no, because finance doesn't have the money. Then when finance says no, they'll say, oh, you didn't give us the money, and that's why we didn't deliver, okay? So that is kind of game number one. Second problem is that the quality of expenditure is so weak, which is the headline number that you started with, right? That the translation of spending into outcomes is so weak. And the biggest reason for that is weaknesses in governance, right? So what the research, so this sounds very pessimistic, right? But what the research also shows in an optimistic way is that, and I'll be here tomorrow with Abhijit Banerjee in the same time, we'll talk more about research and RCTs, but the basic punchline from all of the research is that the social return on investment of better governance is often 10 to 20 times higher than just simply spending more money, right? So the reason for writing the book and kind of calling this a roadmap is to say that in the last 15, 20 years, we have learned so much more with high quality research about how to deliver better services in a much more cost-effective way that we're not acting on, right? So it's really putting that front and center. And then the second thing, like you picked up on, is see, constitutionally, all of these service delivery functions are state government functions, right? So it's just that we And this is a case where, frankly, it's not the center's fault. The center had to step in because the states did not do their job properly. So, in fact, just yesterday I was in a session in Chennai with Arvind Subramaniam and Sumit Bose, who was Joint Secretary SSA, and he was saying how back in the day the centrally sponsored scheme was needed to even get a certain amount of universal education. But the point that matters is today states in India are bigger than most countries, okay? And we look at government of India to solve every one of our problems, whereas the majority of these issues have to be solved at the state level. So the lesson, point number one, is states really have to wake up and kind of take primacy in these social sectors. And second is that there's a whole bunch of low-hanging fruit with governance, right? I mean, that can dramatically shift. So I'll give you just a couple of examples, right? So in education, for example, this is like a tech capital of the world. So we've got some great tech startups, right? So what we've seen in the research, for example, is that personalized software that kind of customizes instruction to the level of the student can be dramatically effective, okay? But where do we spend most of our money? If you look at government IT budgets for kind of education, almost all the budget goes to hardware, okay? But if you look at the research, the hardware by itself has zero impact, okay? We have study after study after study that says just putting a smart board or putting a computer or putting a laptop has zero impact, right? What matters is the integration of the technology with the pedagogy, right? So the basic challenge in government is not that people don't work hard or people this thing, but political and bureaucratic incentives are for the appearance of activity and not for the consequence of that activity, okay? So you will get the computer lab, you will cut the ribbon and saying, dekho, we have provided the computers, but then is it being used after that? So, and that's why I think the data-driven governance becomes one of the most important unifying spines across the book, right? That in every sector we see, and I'll give you another example, not from education, but this is from Telangana. So the Raitu Bandhu scheme that was launched, in Telangana around 2018-19. So when that was launched, my team worked with the government to do one of the simplest things, which was we had an outbound call center that made calls to about 25,000 farmers in 2 weeks and directly measured by talking to the last mile beneficiary, have you received? And that data was used to hold the Mandal agricultural officers accountable, right? And so just doing that, and the beauty is we did a randomized evaluation, but this was staggered, so we have a control group, and just doing that led to about a 25 to 100x increase in that money delivered on time relative to the cost of that call center, right? So there is so much stuff that can be done in data-driven governance that can kind of improve outcomes. Another simple example, just today I was discussing with my team, right? So government invests a lot in hardware, so now they have some facial recognition for student attendance, but nobody's analyzing the data, right? So one of the reasons I built CGIS is precisely to say that the state capacity problem is so all-pervasive that there is such low-hanging fruit that getting better data-driven analytics and decision-making in government can have a meaningful impact. Now, the problem is that the scale of the problem is so big that there is no like silver bullet. And so I think that's the one other caution, that everybody looks for simple solutions to governance, right? High-income countries took 100 years to build effective states. The point is that the last time we did systematic investments in the capacity of the state was in the post-independence kind of era. And the way I tell the story of the Indian state is just like the 1950s ambassador car used to be the metaphor for the Indian economy, pre-liberalization. In many ways, the Indian government still functions like a 1950s ambassador car, right? So you keep on adding burden onto this car, but you haven't upgraded the car itself, okay? So the bureaucrats, so politicians are like the drivers of this car. They're desperately seeing which way to go, but the car is barely moving, okay? The bureaucrats are like your engines and the body and the wheels of this car. So they're trying desperately to keep it moving, but there's no time to redesign the car, okay? So, and redesigning that car then hopefully requires kind of a certain academic perspective that says, here is evidence, here is data, here is a roadmap, and let's kind of go ahead.
Yeah. So building on that, you segue nicely into my second question, which is about data. So data have become controversial. Who is collecting it? How is it collected? Who is analyzing it? Yet there's no denying that it's really useful, as you just pointed out, and it really helps a state understand its economy and how its residents are doing. So can you give us a few examples at the state level? I know you'll talk more about this tomorrow, but kind of where effective data collection and analysis has led to improvement on the ground.
Yeah, so again, I think the Raitu Bandhu example is one very good example. The other thing, since we're in Telangana, see, Telangana is actually the state I've worked with among the longest. In fact, started my work here in 2004 under unified, state. And so another place where Telangana has actually led the country, where we work closely with the government over the past 4-5 years, is we've kind of worked with the government to do the first independent household KPI survey every year that gives you district level estimates of the most important development outcomes, right? And the reason that matters is, see, in government, almost all the accountability is towards schemes, okay? Because again, it is what is visible, right? So the focus is on, I have created a scheme, I have allocated a budget, is that scheme being implemented, okay? But is that getting you development outcomes? We don't see that fast enough, okay? So, because NFHS gives you data on stunting once in 5 years, which is just not, that is okay for conferences and kind of, like a lot of chest thumping and wailing, but that is not enough for management, right? So you need data at a kind of higher frequency, higher quality, higher granularity to be able to then drive decision making at every level of the government, right? So one part of what we've done here is help on the data collection, but the second part is the decision support system, where you look at every level of the government and saying, what are the decisions that are being made at a block, at a mandal level, at a district level, and how would better data then shape some of
Can I just pause you? Can you give us examples? That'll be really helpful.
No, so I think, so one simple example, right, is that, see, look at child malnutrition, okay? So one of the challenges today is that the administrative data that comes from the system is highly, highly inflated, okay? So, and this is even in high-performing human development states, okay? So in the official ICDS data, you'll see a rate of severe malnutrition of 1%. In the independent NFHS, it is 8%, okay? Now, why is this a national tragedy? It's a tragedy because your entire policy for malnutrition is that when I identify a malnourished child, I need to do XYZ downstream actions. But if 85% of your kids are not being identified, okay, then how are you even going to start on that journey, okay? So this is something that we've been working systematically in government of Telangana, starting to put these measurement systems, and it's a process, okay? And I'll be very honest, we have solved technical problems, we haven't solved political problems, right? Because the willingness to accept the data itself is non-trivial, okay? So, but you find pockets where the officers, like, recognize it and then are willing to do stuff. So I think, and part of this also goes to bureaucratic culture, right? See, at the end of the day, what we have to understand about bureaucracies is that they're often good people stuck in a system where the incentives are very, very asymmetric, right? There's very little incentive to do great things because you have to go out of the way, okay? But if something goes wrong on your watch, then there is huge adverse consequences, right? So the default is risk aversion and status quo, okay? So like in any organization, even in the bureaucracy, my assessment is there's about 10 to 20% outstanding kind of initiative-taking leaders. There's about 10 to 20% who are hopeless. And then there's a middle 60% who will go with the flow, okay? So if you're empowering those 20% of change makers, then you kind of bend the system the right way. And the nice thing about working across states is you get different bites of the apple in different states, right? So you'll get a good officer in one department in one state, and a different department in different state, and that's how you collectively move forward.
Sanjay, I want to comment on his numbers. Yeah. I remember in 2000, I asked Chandrababu Naidu, how many of your officers are good officers? So he said to me, 30% are good officers, 30% are useless, and 40% are okay. And I said to him, that's more or less what I have at my office, But now you are saying 10% are good. That's worrying. It's gone down from 30%.
Okay. Let's have a last question up here and then we'll open it up. But for both of you on the elites, and maybe Sanjaya, you could take it first and then Karthik, and we have time, so you can speak at length. So if the wealthy are leaving India, in your book you say 10% of all golden visas worldwide, and this was a new data point for me, are actually taken up by Indians. And the poor are migrating, so countries like Israel and Greece and Italy have really opened up for unskilled labor from India. What are the implications for, Karthik, for you, for public service delivery, and for you about India's economy in the future and this aspiration to be a superpower?
You see, first of all, there is one structural reason why people have been migrating from India for some time now and will continue to do so. And that structural reason is that we have excess population, while there is a demographic transition in many developed countries. that are looking for young people. And therefore, there is a demand for labor, there is supply of labor, and naturally this supply is meeting that demand. The point I make in my book is that till now, this was a market-driven process. For example, the entire Gulf boom, when the Gulf oil crisis resulted in all the Gulf economies becoming rich, and they started constructing, they naturally came to India and employed labor from here, and many of them went, there were private touts who organized this. Even the indentured labor system during the British period, which I have recorded in my book, if you look at the nature of that process, the government only created the legal framework to enable these workers in India to go to Fiji, to Mauritius, to Caribbean. It's the private sector that facilitated it, right? It's private individuals who got the ships, who hired the workers and took them out. And the government only created a legal framework ensuring that the ships are adequately staffed with doctors, etc. Now, same thing happened in the 70s, 80s, 90s with Gulf labor. What is now happening, particularly in the last 5 years, is that the government of India has become itself an agent. So it's the government which has signed an MOU with Israel, because Israeli government does not want to employ Palestinian workers, so they want Indian workers coming out of Uttar Pradesh, Bihar and Rajasthan. The government has signed an MOU with Taiwan, because Taiwanese need skilled labor for their industries, and there are too many people from mainland. They don't want so many more from mainland, so they're taking them from India. We are now officially entering into bilateral agreements with other governments to export Indian labor. And then, Sanjeev Bikhchandani of Naukri.com and Manas Abarwal launched this private initiative called GATI, Global Access to Talented Indians. And who inaugurates it? The Foreign Minister of India. So you have a Foreign Minister launching a private initiative to provide global access to talented Indians. And I asked this question, why the hell is the government getting into this? It's not your job to provide employment for Indians outside India. Your job is to provide employment for Indians in India. So that's one of the kind of issues that my book looks at. So there is a global structural reason why this is happening. But that's one part of the story. And I have no problem with that. I have no problem if workers in Hyderabad find it easier to make money out of Dubai and build a house out here and want to go to Dubai. I have no problem. But if you are, in fact, sending your children to schools that say, if you study in my school, you'll get an admission to a college in New Zealand, or a college in, I was speaking in Chennai at one of these big hotels about my book, and in the lobby there's this big board, Australian, some educational something, on coaching Indians to go to Australia. And the hotel was full of, teenagers, 19, 20-year-olds, the lobby was full of these young people. I thought they'd come to listen to me, but they had come to, listen to this guy who was telling them how to get to Australia, right? So this is the new industry where you're actually providing facility for educated Indians and, creating schools that actually tell you that we'll make sure you get an admission abroad. And then, as you said earlier, you have elite Indians. Now, elite emigration is, of course, a global phenomenon. And India actually comes number 4, I think. Number 1 today is China, the Chinese elite. Many of them go out of the country. Number 2 is actually Britain. The British elite are leaving because all of us are going to Britain, so they're getting out of Britain. And number 3 is India, right? So these elites are going in search of better life. I mean, for all the reasons that Karthik has elaborated, bad governance at home, they're looking for better governance. In August 2024, in his Independence Day speech, Prime Minister Modi promised that he would set up a mission for the ease of living in India. And we are now in January 2026, and I have not heard again about that mission. But The fact is that you need a mission for ease of living in India, because it is the lack of ease of living that is encouraging many, many people to go out. And elite migration, in a sense, worries me more than general migration, because as I said, general migration has both a push effect and a pull effect, because elite migration also has both a push effect and a pull effect. But the fact that there is a push effect working, pushing millionaires out of the country, which is a new phenomenon. I mean, the data shows it basically started around 2012, 2013, but accelerated after 2015. And if you look at the number of Indians giving up Indian citizenship, again, the acceleration in the data is from around 2015 or so. So it's really in the last 10 years that this has now become a big phenomenon that, we proudly say, oh, Dubai is another Indian city, which indeed it is. But the question is, why is no Indian city like Dubai? So that brings us back to the question of governance. And I'm hoping that my book will, stimulate those questions. Why is it that, living in India is becoming increasingly difficult? I mean, the other day, Geeta Gopinath said at Davos that, the biggest problem for India is not tariffs, it's pollution. Right? So these are the kind of things driving the elite out of the country. And finally, let me say again and again, I make this point, that it's a failure of the economics profession, our profession. It's a failure of our profession that in the last 40 years, after Jagdish Bhagwati wrote his essays on brain drain and wealth drain, we haven't had any systematic analysis of this phenomenon. This is the first book that actually raises these questions. But I'm hoping I say this again and again, because whenever I see young people, I say, if you want to do a PhD, this is the subject to go and do your PhD on.
Public service.
Yeah. No, so I think, I'll just pick up on 3 threads. One, quickly on Gati. See, the good thing about Gati is that if you look at globally, the economics of immigration makes sense, but the politics of immigration is increasingly not, right? So one way to use this in a way that both solves Sanjay's problem and helps India, right, is to think about not brain drain, but brain circulation, okay? Where if you have guest worker programs, because the West is aging, they need geriatric care, they don't have the nursing population, right? So if you're able to, where I think there is a genuine role for the Ministry of External Affairs is if you're able to craft these bilateral agreements whereby you say, Japan needs this many nurses, we are going to work on training so that our nurses are meeting those standards, have the language skills, are able to do this for 3 years. And I think there's this thing, it's learn, earn, and return, okay? So that way you're kind of creating a positive pipeline of people, because you see, the interesting thing about skilling is the biggest driver of skilling is if there is a return to that skill, okay? The IT industry, the IT kind of, the education was built not on the IITs, right? It was built by NIT and Aptech catering to kind of the demand from the software company. So similarly, the best way to boost skilling is to boost the demand for that skill, okay? So long term, I think then that's a way of boosting the quality of healthcare in India as well. So I think there's a way to make it work, but one has to be very thoughtful about it, right? That's one. The second, which I know connects governance, and the one answer to your earlier question, which I didn't get to, because then I was talking about technical fixes like data-driven governance. But the question is, where is the political fix, okay, for health and education, all right? So the problem is, what does it take to make health and education politically salient, right, in a way that's not? And even there, again, I'm cautiously optimistic, see, because in the last 15 years, which political party in India has campaigned the most on health and education? Answers? Is the Aam Aadmi Party, correct? So the Aam Aadmi Party is the one party that is single-mindedly focused on health and education. But why? And the answer is actually very simple, right? Because they used to complain that the Chief Minister of Delhi is the weakest Chief Minister in India, okay, which is true. But the positive spin on that is the Chief Minister in Delhi is the most empowered mayor of India. Correct? So, and as a most empowered mayor, it turns out that health and education are the main things that are in their control. So, you focus on the issues that are in your control, okay? So, the way you make governance more salient is by much more meaningful decentralization. And India there is the most over-centralized country in the world, okay? So, and most of our... And one simple, and to be fair, this is not just center to state, it's really state to local, okay? So Raja Challaiah, the famous public finance economist, famously said that everybody wants decentralization up to their level, okay? So every chief minister says Delhi over-centralizes, but they are the biggest culprits in terms of not decentralizing further, okay? So I think the way you solve both the politics of kind of better governance as well as creating the incentives for better service delivery has to be to bring democratic accountability closer to where services are delivered. Now again, there are important historical reasons for why India is so over-centralized, and so I cover that in chapter 8 of the book, since we're talking about books, right? So it's not just like people were power hungry, right? So they were political, they were economic, and the most important reason why service delivery in India is so centralized is actually social, okay? And that's big. So the reason for political centralization is the biggest concern was preserving the union, okay, which is why we're the most centralized kind of constitution. The reason for the economic reason was essentially you were focusing on state-led development and the center was the only thing with resources. But the social reason was that Dr. Ambedkar and the progressive founders of the constitution never trusted local elites to allow marginalized groups to get educated, right? So you were trying to build kind of a modern democratic kind of governance system on one of the most hierarchical, feudal, patriarchal caste societies ever. So the reason you had this kind of centralized bureaucracy was you were trying to bring a modernizing state over a very kind of socially non-kind of, a very hierarchical society. So the point is today, I think 75 years after independence, education levels are much higher, information levels are much higher, that we can in fact decentralize a lot more, but it has to be done in a very thoughtful way. So I think that's how we kind of square this circle. And then the last point I do want to make on elite secession, which is important for everyone here from the research. You see, what has happened is, like you said, the elites have seceded from public services. Now the good news is that research also shows that elites, the services used by elites like airports have improved a lot, okay? So it's not like all public services are bad. When the elites use them, they improve, okay? So the good news here is what the research shows is that when you improve public schools and public facilities, the elite will still benefit even if you don't use it. And that's because what the research shows is that when you improve the free public option, the market is forced to improve to compete against a better free public option. So there's a cascade effect that pushes the quality of services across the entire distribution. So even if you're an elite here who's never directly using public services, you have a stake in better public service delivery.
Yeah. Right? So it's like when you have systems that work for people with disabilities, it works for everyone.
Exactly.
It's perfect, yeah. And we are right on the dot. We should be proud of ourselves. Let's open it up for questions. Here are the volunteers with mics. Can we start here, person with the maroon shirt? Yeah. And everyone, please make it a question, no comments, and keep it as short as possible.
My name is Sudhakar. I am from ICFI. My question is about Raitu Bandhu. If we are measuring how fast the services or the amount was transferred to the accounts, that is one measure, one metric. Have we measured the money transferred was to uncultivated land, to the rocky land, to rich farmers and all? So which economist who is working for the measurement of public welfare schemes should be blamed for what happened in the previous regime?
Do you want to collect questions or just do one at a time? We'll just do one. Yes, I'll keep it. Yeah, I'll keep it very fast, right? So I think you're right. So there are two aspects of any policy. There's the design and delivery, correct? So my specific intervention was just on delivery. Now, the larger question of design, particularly with regard to cash transfers. See, the most important question is what is the counterfactual? Okay, where else would that money have been used? Okay. Now, the important thing with farmers is that there was political demand for supporting farmers. Okay, so if the counterfactual was loan waivers, Raitu Bandhu is actually better than loan waivers, okay? Because it actually doesn't have the distortionate effects on credits. So there are other things that governments do. Raitu Bandhu is way better than free electricity. Now, of course, they do free electricity also. So that's why it all depends on what is the opportunity cost, okay? So the one thing I will say about cash transfers to the poor is that, we've just finished one of the largest randomized controlled trials in Jharkhand of the impact of kind of putting money in the bank accounts of women. And the good news is that, it's very, very clear that it increases, household food consumption, education, nutrition, and also female empowerment, right? So when we think about the gender dimension of empowerment, one thing that people don't understand often is there's a huge intra-household gradient of consumption, that you often have poor people in non-poor households, and those poor people tend to disproportionately be women. So there are ways in which this can be a good thing, but it requires careful analysis about what the counterfactuals are.
I'm Venkat Srinivas Reddy, Sanjay's classmate. I'm from school, HPS, but I will not ask him the question because let the others ask him a question. I would like to ask Mr. Karthik Muralidharan. Firstly, I wish you had been born much earlier in India. We could have benefited a lot more. Secondly, did you give lectures to the chief ministers, the cabinets, and the MLAs of any state, educate them what needs to be done and what should not be done? And how many of them have done it, and what is the response? Thank you.
See, here is the good news, right? I think the good news, and I've personally been overwhelmed, I think, by how the book seems to have struck a chord among so many kind of segments, right? So I typically talk to IAS officers all the time, but in the past 18 months, I've now met multiple chief ministers and finance ministers, including in Telangana, like, where the CM spent about an hour and a half. See, the good news is that I think the politicians are also desperately looking for good ideas, okay? So, see, there is an old politics of polarization of identity, caste, region, religion, and there is a new politics of governance and service delivery, okay? So the old politics is not over, okay? But the old politics only gets you 20% of the vote. That next 20% requires you to deliver, okay? Which means that every party has one axis of mobilization that is about identity, and every party then has to deliver, okay? If you look at what the formula for success is, okay? So, which means that there is a desire. Now, the problem is that today, one of the structural problems I'm seeing in every state, in many states, I think Telangana is actually better on this count, is actually growing distrust between the politicians and the bureaucracy, right? The politicians increasingly say, we want to do this, the bureaucrats are not delivering. But that's unfair because you've not invested in the public systems, right? So the point is that there's no silver bullet, correct? But you have to kind of first build the awareness. So the good news, I'll tell you, in addition to chief ministers, so I was in a state recently where I gave a workshop to all the top officers, Chief Secretary, Development Commissioner, Finance Secretary, and all the district collectors were dialing in by video conference. But the next day, the Deputy Chief Minister in that state said, why are you only doing this for the officers? Ab vidhayakon ke liye aise session kyun nahi le rahe ho, right? So the good news is at least there is desire. And earlier this week, I gave my first lecture to 45 MLAs from about 15 states in Delhi. And they all wanted to do follow-up virtual discussion. So at least the desire to understand is there. So but it's a process, right? It's a process. So that's why the hope is that, this is, the book is really written not just for leaders, it's written for citizens. It's written for everybody. And chapter 18 on state, citizens and society talks about how different segments of society can each contribute, So, yeah.
Yeah, this is Divakar here.
Sorry.
Last question.
I have,
here. Yeah.
Sorry, I have say on who's asking questions, if you don't mind. We want some young people, some women.
Okay.
Women? I don't see any woman. Oh, there's a young and woman. Thank you. Over there, beige. No, right there, long hair and beige. Oh, here also. You're next. You're next. Yeah.
All right. Hello, my name is Anjana, and my question is to Mr. Baru. When the H-1B fee hike happened 4-5 months ago, all of us were concerned, and there was a huge talk about brain drain and how, if anything, this could potentially be an opportunity for India to reverse brain drain, right? Yeah. But I have to ask, why is it necessarily a bad thing that migration is happening? Aside from, if you say that there is a moral responsibility for Indians to take care of their own country, sure. But aside from that, I also see real-time practical value to it in a certain sense, right? They go abroad, they learn R&D, where the certain Western countries are better at research and development than we are. And it's okay for them to learn that and potentially at some point come back and invest. Satya Nadella, for instance, has signed MOUs, has signed agreements with state governments in India. So I don't necessarily see migration as a bad thing in the short term, if that makes sense. So are there any aspects of this which you believe I should be considering as well? That's it.
Thank you. This is a question I've asked everywhere. And the answer is very simple. I would be very happy, Karthik talked about brain circulation. Now, if you look at the literature, the theory of brain circulation has been going around for the last quarter century. But there's no data. The government of India puts out data on the Indians going out, Indians giving up citizenship, millionaires going out, number of H-1B visas being given. We don't get official data on who's coming back. We have no data. So the problem right now, over the last 40 years, is of exit. There's no re-entry happening. There is no evidence of Indians learning something overseas. You talked about nurses. Nurses are going out, no nurses coming back to improve services in hospitals here, right? The only exception to this rule, to some extent, is in the pharma industry, where people have come back, but most of the people working in the Indian pharma industry are trained in India. Very few have actually gone abroad and come back. There are some who have. IT again is a sector where some people have come back. But if you look at the numbers of exit and look for the data on re-entry, there's just no data to tell you. And anecdotally also, I keep asking people, give me an example. Give me, in the 1950s, Jawaharlal Nehru invited talent back to India to build your nuclear program. Homi Bhabha, your space program, Vikram Sarabhai, institutions around Hyderabad, many of them headed by people who came back to India because the government of India attracted high quality global talent, whether it's a Homi Bhabha or a Vikram Sarabhai or Jnan Chandra Ghosh, who set up the Indian Institutes of Technology, right? Give me one example now. One example of any great Indian institution that has been set up by people who have come back. Or, as you mentioned, H-1B, how many have come back to work? They will, I say in my book, I have a chapter called Indians in MAGA, Indians in Making America Great Again. I have a chapter on that in my book. So, I want to see how many of those Indians who are now making America great again will come back to make India great. We have no evidence. So this claim that somehow I'll go abroad, see, Mahatma Gandhi went abroad, studied abroad, worked abroad, and came back. We make his return date Pravasi Bharatiya Divas, January 9th, right? That generation had so many people who came back. And I give a lot of names in my book, of people who did exactly what you are hoping would happen. But today that is not happening. And that is why it's important for someone to raise the question, why is it not happening?
I just wanted to see 10 seconds to this. I don't, and just to kind of build on Sanjay. See, I don't think there's anything here that's a criticism of the individuals. I think Sanjay's point is it's more a source of soul searching. That what is it that we are doing that is not able to bring that talent, right? I mean, back. So I think that's the way in which it is intended, not as a criticism. It's always individually rational to exit, right? Like, I mean, just like it's individually rational to connect it back to service delivery, right? Again, sorry, because the stories tell the thing. I remember 2002 going to a village in Madhya Pradesh at 11 o'clock and going and seeing that the school was closed, the teacher was absent, and I went to the Sarpanch and I said, like, where does your child go to school? So he said he goes to the nearby private school. So and then I asked him, sir, like, आपका बच्चा इधर जा रहा है तो like, ये सरकारी स्कूल का क्या होगा? So he said, sir, आप ठीक तो कह रहे हैं, लेकिन जब तक ये स्कूल मैं सुधार सकूं, मेरे बच्चों का भविष्य बिगड़ गया होगा, right? Like, so, which means it is always individually rational to exit, okay? But that individual exit is a warning signal for us as a collective, that are we doing the right things as a collective? So I think that's the way I would interpret that message.
One last question, this lady in front, and then we're done.
Hello. Yeah, this is both to Sanjaya and Karthik. I think I want to keep it very short. So, at the core of public service delivery is your local bodies, right? So, your meetings with Chief Minister, Prime Minister, perhaps the secretaries would have a ideological or visioning value to it. Whereas they will not give you your birth certificate, they don't give you your death certificate, or they don't get you water connection, right? How does this effective ideological visioning exercises at a leadership level will seep into the local body level? Because at the heart of Indian democracy and public service delivery is your local bodies. And if we see, especially the South Indian states, in spite of having high all sorts of socio-economic indicators are faring very poor in decentralizing functions. You know, they know how to do the job, but they don't have money to the job. So yeah.
You know, I can tell you from personal knowledge that when you have an Independence Day speech of the Prime Minister, the day after the Independence Day, that speech is broken down into policy announcements, and various ministries are given responsibility for implementation of that policy announcement. The one policy announcement which I mentioned earlier, made in August 2024, was to launch a mission for the ease of living in India, which has not been launched. And I've been asking this question to various people in Delhi. What happened to that? That's an announcement in the Independence Day speech. So to answer your question, if that mission is launched, and if that mission's objectives are specified, each of these will become issues. For example, you say, what does it take for your life to become simpler when it comes to payment of electricity bill, water bill, education, KYC forms being filled, selling land, buying land. You know, each of us in our day-to-day life have a lot of problems. And if only we sit down and list the problems and ask the question, what can be done to resolve these problems? It's not a big deal. It's not a big deal at all. It's very simple public policy intervention, provided we actually sit down to address that.
Yeah, I'll just say, one final thing here. See, I think it's a mistake to kind of expect that all the solutions will come from the top, right? I think these are things like Sanjay said, even if that mission has not translated, there's nothing that prevents every state or a group of citizens in every state from coming and saying, here are our problems and here is a set of implementable solutions, right? So Ashwin Mahesh, who's a decentralization advocate in Bangalore, I quote him in, again, chapter 8, where he says the best way to solve India's many problems is to increase the number of problem solvers, okay, right? So it is not like you wait for, India's 1.4 billion people. We're more than the entire Western hemisphere put together, right? 1.5 times North America, Central America, South America put together. You don't expect that these problems are going to be solved at that aggregate level, right? So, and the important thing, going back to the Raja Chalaya quote, see, no politician climbs the greasy pole of power to then give up power. Okay, so that is something that citizens have to reclaim, and that comes partly from taking that civic action, and I think urban governance is the most logical place for that journey to start.
Thank you so much, everyone. You've been a great audience, and thank you, Sanjaya and Karthik.
The full house, the packed house is a testimony, for the most engaging conversation we have had so far. Thank you so much, Sanjay, Karthik, and Suchitra. Their books are available at the book point, and they will be there, to sign. Please go pick up the book and, grab the opportunity of getting an autographed copy, please.